So with that, I want to give the floor to Ismintha.
Oh, thank you. I will share my screen. So that basically means that you will not really see me, and I won't really see you. But let me first say thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to be here. I'm a little bit nervous also. I guess we're colleagues, but we're really different colleagues that I'm used to, so I'm quite excited. I will tell you something about my research on indeed issues of diversity, discrimination, social boundaries. If you have any questions, because I will probably not see you, I am okay with you just opening your microphone and interrupting me while I'm speaking to ask whatever you want to ask. So please feel free to do so. And it's also fine, of course, if you wait for afterwards. But if you have any clarification questions or whatever, just open your mic, I would say. I'm going to start sharing. All right. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Yes. So like I said, it's my talk is on social boundaries, subtle discrimination, and feelings of belonging. And as I was introduced already, I work at the Vrije Universiteit here in Amsterdam in the Department of Sociology as indeed a postdoctoral researcher. So just a short overview of what I would like to talk about today. I will give you a little bit of an introduction of who I am actually, as you all know me. And also, as was described also in the abstract that I sent, so why does it even matter to talk about diversity in organizations? I will try to explain, hopefully, through this idea of what social boundaries are and how they are expressed in organizations or how they come to the fore in organizations. And I will zoom in a little bit more on instances of subtle discrimination that might happen in organizations, as well as the importance, or perhaps not so importance, of the concept of belonging and how that might actually come across in organizations. And I will do that along the lines of a survey that we did at IoP Amsterdam, and that I also talked about a couple of months ago in February during a talk at IoP on the importance of belonging.
Ismintha, sorry to
yes?
interrupt you for a second. We hear some background noise.
Okay.
Is there something maybe to do to reduce it?
Could be my computer indeed. I don't know, I'm working with headphones, so I can take off the headphones and maybe that makes it better, but then you might have some background noise from my house, but let's try. Is this better?
No, it's the same.
It's the same? Sorry. Then it's probably the ventilator of my computer, which you hear. I don't know what to do about that because...
I actually have the feeling that it's not switching to the microphone of your headset.
Ah. So, but you now hear it still?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Is it very annoying?
A little.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know what to do about it. I think I will actually turn on the headset again. Maybe just try to keep the microphone in my hand and shield it a little bit from any other noise. Maybe that helps. Does it help? Any feedback?
Not much, but maybe we can move on.
I think it's okay, yeah.
Because if you speak up, it should be quite okay.
Okay, I will try to speak up a little bit more. So, sorry, I have a very old computer, so that's basically, I think, what is the problem. So yeah, let me continue by introducing myself a little bit. I think by now everybody has read who I am. Not the entire picture, of course, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea who you have in front of you. So I'm a sociologist. I was not born here in the Netherlands, but in Suriname, in the capital city of Paramaribo. And I moved here when I was to Amsterdam when I was 2. I grew up here, went to school, loved the city actually, as I always also projected through a heart. I'm also a mother of a 16-year-old girl who actually wants to study physics, so that's quite interesting. And I am in migration research in sociology. So I've done research on the second generation, so people, for example, born here but with parents from elsewhere. And currently I'm in a project where we kind of shifted the focus on migration, but also integration issues by looking at people without a migration background who live in cities that have what we call become majority minority cities. So for example, in Amsterdam, over 50% of the inhabitants have a migration background. And we are now trying to understand how the people without a migration background live in a city where numerically they are now also a minority group. I love reading books, and I'm kind of introvert, so for me this is always kind of a challenge to do these talks, but basically, I try to always do it not just to challenge myself, but because I do really find the topic important to discuss, to give more information on, and to explain a little bit more what might be the case when we talk about diversity in organizations. And that also brings me to this idea of why it even matters to talk about it. Well, I think it matters because a lot, maybe not all of the time, but a lot of the time you kind of not realize how important diversity is basically in organizations. So, and this could be any type of diversity. So it doesn't have to be about ethnicity, it can be about gender, it can be about able-bodiedness or less able-bodiedness. It can be about sexual preference or any form of gender identity. And it can also be about whether you are an international or national. But in the end, it's about difference. And this is important to talk about because it can be uncomfortable in a way to talk about difference. And I also think it's important when we talk about diversity in organizations to focus on the similarities, whether this being the fact that we all wear these masks nowadays, or any similarities that we might have beyond the differences that we also have. So I think this is sometimes a way to also make it more accessible to talk about diversity by also focusing on the fact that we're colleagues, for example, makes us a particular type of professional where you can relate to each other in a certain way beyond difference. So this is for me one of the reasons I always like talking about diversity, because it has implications. It has there are also expectations always around diversity, but let's not forget to also consider the commonalities and the similarities that we share. And why is this important? Well, here I think come in the social boundaries. So in the abstract, there was already this definition that is now also here. So this is about these group lines, and I used it for my own research to focus more on ethnic group lines, but it doesn't have to be about ethnicity. But it is about group lines that demarcate who either belongs within the group lines or who doesn't. And these group lines are, of course, not visible, therefore not very explicit, but nevertheless, they are there. And I think if you kind of picture a situation in which you felt like, well, I'm not one of the group, that you can kind of sense what I'm getting at, like, why did you feel like that? What was there that made you feel that you weren't really part of a group? And it was usually probably not something that you could really pinpoint or explain that well, but the feeling was there nevertheless. So this idea of belonging within the boundary lines or not is what social boundaries are all about. And social boundaries in organizations, as I would claim, and not just me, but there are other scholars who say this as well, are reflections actually of group differences and associated stereotypes that exist in society at large. And this is of course different in various societies, but in the Dutch context, we usually see that in the past decades, basically, there has been a shift in talking about multiculturalism from, this idea of we have to have respect for difference and people should be able to keep their own cultural values and their own cultural practices, to a shift towards, well, assimilation even, where it is about becoming integrated, not just economically in the labor market, but also culturally, in terms of accepting the fact that if you live here in the Netherlands, you have to behave in a certain way, you have to give up certain ideas about, what we would call old-fashioned ideas about, for example, gender patterns or homosexuality. And this shift from more cultural, from a more economic to cultural integration is also reflected in the way we think of difference in organizations. And I would like to give you an example, which is based on the Elites project. And in the Elites project, I interviewed people of the second generation in 4 European countries. Meaning that they were born in one of these 4 countries, but all of them had parents who were born in Turkey. So they were, for example, Turkish-Dutch second generation. And all of the parents were very low educated. Some of them were not educated, and the people that we interviewed were all professionals. So they had gone through higher education and were working in the labor market as in a particular professional position. In my case, these were professionals in the education sector. And so I will give you a quote by one of my respondents saying, well, I had a female colleague with certain ideas about me being a Muslim and how Muslim men perceive women. And she told me that these ideas were inhibiting her behavior at work. So here, I think you clearly see in this quote that particular ideas that are very much alive in Dutch society when it comes to, it's both ethnicity and gender come together here. And the ideas that are present in Dutch society concerning Muslim men actually are brought into the organization, which is not very strange, of course. People don't leave behind all their ideas at the front door of the organization. So they enter the organization and they actually have an effect there. And this is a social boundary that is drawn up between 2 colleagues that is actually based both on gender and on ethnicity. So what this entails actually is that we have to acknowledge to a certain extent, and this is, this can be up for discussion, but I think it's important to mention that there is this idea of a norm employee. So there's this idea of an employee in an organization which fits the organization just a little bit better than other employees. And this is still very much based on, well, a white, middle-aged male from either middle or upper class background. I have to, I'm being honest here. Some of the references here are quite old. So you could argue with me like, okay, if there's a reference from 1992, to what extent can we still make this applicable to 2021? But I think this basic idea of there being something like a norm employee is just, I'm just giving it to you as something that, that is out there, we can discuss. But given the fact that, if you bear with me, that there is something like a norm employee, we also have to acknowledge the idea that people coming into the organization who are not fitting this norm employee are therefore always different. And this idea of the newcomer in the organization, and that can be anybody who doesn't fit the above description, is different and is not considered the one who fits the particular position that the norm employee takes, you know, as well as that norm employee does. And what this actually might lead to are forms of discrimination. What I saw in my own research is that, particularly in the upper echelons of organizations, so these people working in professional positions, really explicit, blatant forms of discrimination are not very common at all. So we kind of know how to behave, and that discrimination is really not part of how you should behave. So I think we all agree on that, that it's not okay to discriminate, and that you don't want to be associated as someone who does, and you really don't want to be, you know, be called someone who is discriminatory. However, subtle discrimination, that is something that I saw a lot more often in the stories that I heard from these professionals. And what I mean by subtle discrimination is that I talked about behavior which is entrenched in common and everyday interactions in the workplace. And these behaviors take the shape, for example, of harassment or jokes, incivility or avoidance, and any other type of disrespectful treatment. And this idea of subtle discrimination, I think, is an important way of looking at really everyday experiences in the workplace. And it is because of the subtleness, and subtle discrimination doesn't mean that the outcomes are subtle of discrimination. So people do really experience the discomfort, the hurt that goes along with it. Nevertheless, it is very difficult to substantiate your idea that actually I've been discriminated because it's so subtle. And I'll just give you a couple of these ideas. Like there are quite some comics on you know, forms of harassment or subtle discrimination in the workplace. And I think a very interesting one is the one where you see the lady with the pink jacket sitting there thinking, what should I do? And I think that that is really something that the people that I talk to who were confronted with jokes in the workplace, oftentimes they had to wrap their head around what just happened, what was just said. Why am I feeling uncomfortable? I do realize that something is really off, but by the time you get to reacting, everybody's gone home, at least in the comic, not necessarily in real life. But this idea of you know, thinking, did this just really happen, actually? I think that is something that jokes oftentimes do, that you kind of cannot believe that it was said, but it was actually said. And you do also feel that you don't like it, and you might even start to get mad. And this joking around as a form of subtle discrimination is something that happened quite a lot to the people that I talked to for the Elites project. And I give you a quote from a second-generation Turkish Dutch lawyer. And I always think it's important to give you a little bit of background. By now, you might have already read the quote, but this particular professional, he was really taken in by this law firm as a very promising lawyer. He entered the law firm right after finishing his studies. I think he was even still wrapping up his studies, and they saw him. They knew that they had someone there, you know, that would really be promising. He felt very much welcome at the firm. He was on his way in a track to actually becoming a partner. So it wasn't that he was being frustrated in his career. However, this particular joke was not an exception. So he had more of these instances where he thought, well, actually, yeah, this is prejudice, or this could be considered prejudice. So I will just read it out loud for those who somehow haven't read it yet. He says, I came back from a ski trip, and he had actually driven through the night for 12 hours to get to this particular meeting in the morning, where everybody entered the conference room, and one of the partners saw me and says, hey, my car has been stolen. Do you know where it is? So yes, you enter the room. Okay, and my reaction was, well, what kind of car is it? A Volvo. Oh, okay, it's already on its way to Russia then. I mean, you could also consider that to be a microaggression, basically, by the way. But everybody was laughing, and those are things that could be considered prejudice. And it's this type of joking around in an organization that happens a lot. And for some people, the jokes are actually really uncomfortable and resemble sort of discrimination. Why is it so hard? Well, not to joke around, but to also deal with jokes as a form of sort of discrimination in the workplace? Well, I would argue that first and foremost, and this is not just jokes, but it's more in general, if you look at forms of subtle discrimination, you see that they are part of the structure and fabric of organizations, and especially jokes. And I mean, it might not be everywhere, but in the Dutch context, I think jokes are really part of organizational culture. And jokes, and I call them perpetrators, not by accident, but purposefully, it allows the so-called jokers to hide their intentions, even from themselves, and they can maintain the image of being non-discriminatory because it's part of the organizational culture. You can always say, well, actually, you know, I'm just kidding. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke. Don't be a sourpuss, for example. So this idea of jokes being socially acceptable in an organizational context actually creates barriers in this same context. And these barriers can hinder forms of belonging of so-called newcomers in the context of organizations. And that brings me to this idea of belonging and what that entails. It's not a very good slide. Looking at it now from this perspective, there's a lot of text on it. Basically, what I wanted to do here was explain to you what does it mean. And I think important here is that belonging goes beyond a particular place. So it's a feeling of being at home. But that is not excluded, or it's not exclusively linked to a place. So you can feel belonging to a place like your house, or even your workplace, or the university building or whatnot. But the feeling of belonging goes beyond that. And this is what I put in bold text. It's also related to a feeling of comfort, of safety, and familiarity. So it can be linked to a place, but it goes beyond a feeling of home at a particular, in a particular space, so to speak. It's this personal and intimate sense, basically, of being allowed to be there, including all of you. So, of course, everybody has to adjust, but there's room for your difference, and that creates a feeling of belonging. And so this is where I kind of go to another data set, which is based on the survey Belonging at Vrije that we did. We conducted that 2 years ago in 2019. So it was before COVID. We will do it again next year among students at Vrije University to actually, it's like a feeling thermometer where we ask them, so to what extent do you feel you belong at Vrije or your particular study? And we also ask questions pertaining to experiences with discrimination, where you can report discrimination, but also things like group formation, how students are doing in terms of obtained ECTS, and a broad range of questions, basically, that we kind of linked to feelings of belonging. And one of the things that we found was the importance of recognition. And this links back, I think, to the idea of the newcomer and the more established norm employee. So the importance of recognition in terms of belonging, I wanted to share with you this quote of one of the students who took the effort, and a lot of students took the effort to also give to answer open questions. The spaces were really filled out tremendously with a lot of experiences. And this particular student said that during my bachelor, we started off with 500 students, whereby you could count the students with a Moroccan background, including myself, on the fingers of one hand. I think that this is a big difference to, for example, the law bachelor. When I look at how it is a reflection of society, I definitely feel that I belong at VU. But if I just look at my master, then that's not always the case. So I think that what is happening here is that these particular students as well, because I recognize myself in fellow students at VU, in general, I do feel that I belong because I'm not the only one. Whereas in my particular bachelor, I do feel kind of different, or not even kind of, I do feel different. And that actually has repercussions for his feelings of belonging in his studies. And it's also reflected in the second quote, where someone actually says, well, I like being able to see people who look like me on the campus. And this gives me a greater sense of belonging. It confirms what I think, and it reassures me that I'm actually accepted here. Well, this feeling is completely reversed, however, when I attend the lecture on micros, where no one resembles me at all, either in terms of appearance or political views. And there again, you see that it really seems to matter to students that they don't just hear that, of course, VU is very welcoming and we don't discriminate, but actually they want to be able to recognize themselves in the people around them. So like I said, we also asked questions on exclusion and discrimination. And again, I should have done this slide differently, but it doesn't matter anymore. I have 4 quotes, and they all pertain to different forms of diversity. But what we found is that there is actually something like a norm student. So the students without a migration background, with who are cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, they really do experience a lot less exclusion or discrimination than students belonging to a marginalized group. And actually their belonging is also, their feeling of belonging is also higher. So just to focus on one of these, I will focus on the third. It says, I have had various upsetting interactions with fellow students who were making extremely negative comments about homosexuality, thinking that I shared their opinion. I also think that acceptance at the university has become less visible since the gay network was discontinued. I understood from the organizers that their participation in VU-wide events was no longer always appreciated. And so not just being able to recognize yourself, but also being able to, feeling represented in an institution, knowing that there is space given to your particular marginalized group identity, really helps at least students to feel that they are more accepted and therefore also belong at this particular place. In the case of VU, of course, there was also the incident with the Nashville Declaration, where a couple of VU professors actually supported the declaration. Of course, VU responded by, with their own declaration saying, of course, we support LGBTQ+ students, but nevertheless, it had a very profound impact on a lot of students who identify differently than heterosexual. So again, there's more quotes than that, and there's different forms of experiences of exclusion or discrimination, but they all do have this, they all do lead to diminished feelings of belonging. So generally experiencing or observing exclusion or discrimination seems to have a major impact on the extent to which students feel that they belong at their university. And I think this is also interesting to extrapolate to. You don't have to keep this at a student level. I think also for people who work at the university, I think recognition is something that can play an important role. And actually also diversity among staff at the university was something that was considered by many students with some form of marginalized identity to be lacking seriously, actually. So I think that belonging in that sense and the feeling that you belong somewhere does have to do with, am I one of these newcomers? Am I one of these people different from the norm? And to what extent does that mean that I actually fit and belong here? And then I ended with the slide, so what can we do? And as you can see, it's completely blank because I also think that this is something that is not for me to say. I think it's something to discuss, both in terms of experiences as well as in terms of, so what are the parameters of the organization? To what extent can we move beyond these parameters? Really, what can we do if we think about the social boundaries and subtle forms of discrimination and feelings of belonging? So I wanted to actually stop my talk there and also, yeah, engage in a form of discussion or give the floor to people who want to share. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's all unmute and thank you, Ismintha. And we have plenty of time for questions and discussions. So if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or you can also put a question in the chat and I will ask it.